Hey everyone, this is Vignesh. And before we dive into today's episode, on behalf of everyone at ContraMinds, I'd like to wish you and your loved ones a very happy new year. Thank you for supporting us all the way through 2021. We look forward to an abundance of courage, well being, and a relentless passion for lifelong learning all through 2022. Thanks again for all your support and your good wishes. It means the world to us.
If you kind of if you're forcing yourself, I need to be creative, I need to do something differently, I need to kind of differentiate myself from others, then it might be a false metric to actually track. I mean, you first got to solve that user's problem. Look at it this way, is that the user has a certain problem, or there's something about this, why this is working. So unless and until you kind of hit the right notes on those counts, what is the point in kind of just coming up with something new for the sake of it?
Welcome to a brand new episode of ContraMinds. In today's episode, we are in conversation with Amit Ranjan. Amit is best known as the co founder of Slideshare, the world's largest community for sharing professional content, including presentations, infographics, documents, and videos. In 2012, Slideshare was acquired by LinkedIn, and as of 2020, it has been acquired by Scribd. Amit is also an angel investor and advisor to several early stage startups in India, Singapore, and the United States, such as Open, Traction, and Khatabook, among many others. He is currently the architect of two projects under the Digital India mission at National eGov Division, Ministry of Information Technology. These projects are Digital Locker, which is a national ecosystem for paperless governance by digitizing citizen records and enabling digital usage of these records, and OpenForge, an open source initiative aimed at building a national source code sharing platform for collaborative development of eGov applications. In this episode, Amit speaks to us about crossing the startup government chasm, what it takes to build a digital nation project at scale, and why technology alone isn't enough to build a great product company. As always, we have shared selected links and show notes from this episode on the ContraMinds website. You can check it out at www.contraminds.com/blog. And now, here is our conversation with Amit Ranjan.
So, Amit, I wanted to start off with a point which you had written about in Forbes recently, where you are talking about how does India give birth to a global, software product company, and what does it take to make a global software product company out of India? And I found that article really interesting. So I thought we'll start our conversation right from there. And one of the key points that I wanted to understand from you is how does a project thinking and a product thinking really differ?
Right, right. So, yes, that article I wrote recently, and it's actually, I've written that essay essentially about 3 years back, and every time I've kind of, rewritten a slightly newer version of it, and every time I do that, there's something I add, something I take away. It's a topic which is very dear to my heart. It kind of, in many ways, if you look at my resume, you'll see that the key trends that you will notice in my professional journey. I think a lot of it tends to, some of the ethos behind it tends to get captured in that article. That article can also be seen by ranting by some people, and I've faced that pushback as well. But coming to the point, so I think so India is doing great in the technology world overall. I mean, we are blessed and fortunate to have such a large technology sector. We have the lion's share in services. We are doing so well in terms of new age startups. The Indian market is exploding. There's like 60, 70 unicorns, and so overall, I think the country has done a fantabulous job. One area which where we are still lacking is software products, and even within software products, I would single out global software products. We really haven't had a lot of big name successes coming out of India. And I think part of it has to do with maybe just the environment or the culture in which the Indian technology ecosystem is existing, and we are brought up in that culture. So um, you asked the difference between project mindset and the product mindset. I think the reference, just to be clear, the reference to the project mindset was largely coming from a government point of view, simply because I've been working in the government. I wouldn't necessarily ascribe the project viewpoint to what you see in the startup world or in the private sector. So that specific reference was from a governmental point of view. But nevertheless, I think the bigger point is, what is it that is lacking in Indian companies, Indian startups, whereby we are not able to kind of birth these big global companies, right? I think that is a key point here. And I feel that at the very at the very broad level, at the biggest level, I think you have to kind of look at the mindset, some of the mindsets that we kind of harbor in ourselves and we are brought up with since we grow up. And that is something I've talked about in that article, and I can talk about a couple of them which I feel are important for this discussion. So I think the first and foremost thing is that, see, a lot of the metrics, a lot of the successes, a lot of the things that abound in India, unfortunately, tend to be more concentrated on quantity parameters, right? We are the biggest, we are the largest, we have the highest FDI, we are the biggest, in terms of markets, GDP, come what may. I mean, we time and again refer to these metrics. And truth be told, the reality is that when you talk quantity, it kind of, it's some way or the other, it's a proxy for the fact that we are 1.3 billion people, right? It's a proxy for the fact that we are one of the second most populated country in the world. So to me, honestly, I always don't take these quantity parameters and metrics as something that we should always be celebrating about. I think there is certain aspects to it that need to be celebrated, and they need to we need to kind of talk about it, but we need to focus on quality parameters. And especially coming from the product world, if you look at the most innovative companies, if you look at the companies that have made a name for themselves as product innovators, the hallmark of their existence is quality. They did something which was better than anybody else in the world. They did something which was not possible before. They don't necessarily say right at the onset that we build something that is used by the most number of people. They kind of focus on the core problem, they focus on the qualitative aspects. And that is something I feel that in India we got to kind of definitely kind of change our mindset and start thinking in terms of these quality parameters as well, because this kind of goes into our DNA. It goes into the way we think, and the way you think kind of gets reflected in the way you act and the way you kind of go about running your own business, right? So that is one of the points of view. The second point that I think you see very often, and this is something, given my personal experience, what we did with Slideshare and later on in the government, is that I think when you're thinking product innovation, when you're thinking in a creative way, uh, I think the market factors and the competitive factors are important, but you should not preload them, right? If you preload them, and what I mean by preloading them is that you, right at the onset, you start asking, okay, show me the business model, show me the money. And I think it is a legitimate question to ask. I mean, you can obviously have that point of view saying that unless and until this thing makes money, this is all sham. This doesn't work. And I think that's a legitimate point of view. But my submission is that I think it works in certain cases. It does, that way of thinking does not necessarily work in other cases, or it puts you at a relative disadvantage. So when you're thinking products, I think you've got to focus on the user, focus on the problem the user has, and kind of solve for that, right? I think there's a more extreme version of that product thinking, which is what we've seen with the likes of Steve Jobs and Henry Ford's, where they used to say that you don't need to even ask the customer. I mean, if you ask Henry Ford's famous saying that if I asked customers, we would have faster horses, right? But I'd keep that line of thinking aside. I mean, Henry Ford and Steve Jobs and Elon Musk's are very rare product visionaries. Most people wouldn't kind of measure up to their levels. But for most people, you'd have to ask the customer, or you have to focus on the customer, and kind of at that moment, I don't think you should preload these monetization and these business variables. The business variables and the monetization variables in some of these cases can come in a little later.
No, that's a fantastic response, Amit. I mean, it's an encapsulation of the entire article to a certain sense, and in fact, I think the quantity quality point that you had raised, I'd actually noted that down as a specific talking point, and you had already covered it up. So, thank you so much for that. But there's another aspect of the article that really stood out to me, which is, you know, India has got a lot of success stories recently in the SaaS and consumer product space. But when it comes to core platforms and infrastructure, we're not hearing so much about it. So would it have something to do with the R&D culture or how research institutions operate in our country? So what are your thoughts on how can we also become a core platform and infrastructure powerhouse in the coming future?
Right, correct. So that is definitely another of the, I would say, the gaping holes in our capability and our skill set is that uh, there is obviously applied technologies and applied things, but there's also pure things that you got to kind of build these platforms, because what you realize, and especially in technology, is that the companies which build these platforms, they kind of get into the foundational DNA of the entire ecosystem. And once you are kind of you have a platform that has been used to build things on top, then it's very hard for a later entrant or a later participant to come and dislodge you, right? So that is the case with, it could be with many software platforms. I mean, think like Windows and Linux and Android, and I think so that is an area of where we again kind of the Indian industry is a little bit lacking. And I think you're rightly pointing out that I think that has to do with lower level of investments in R&D. uh, and also I think you probably need a very strong and a cohesive partnership between academia and industry to kind of kickstart that. I think that's starting to happen now in India. And what we are seeing, especially around the Bangalore region, where I think Bangalore traditionally came up 20, 25, 30 years ago. Part of the reason was that because of the presence of academic institutions, and they initially kind of set up some of these capabilities that the manufacturing industry needed. I think it kind of in a smaller way it mirrors what happened in Silicon Valley in 60, 70, 80 years ago. So yes, I mean, for to have the capabilities to birth these core foundational platforms, the country would need much larger levels of R&D and investment in patenting, and kind of closer interaction between industry and academia. And I think the government as well. I think the government can think of it as a triumvirate. It's a troika where government, academia, and industry needs to kind of come together to make that happen.
Just to take it one step further, if I can ask. So I think many years back, I think Mark Andreessen had written an essay called "Create One, Two, Three Many Silicon Valleys" or something like that, where his founding hypothesis was that look, Silicon Valley is great at software, right? So
Correct.
other places should not do software. Okay. He says that instead you should focus on other technologies, like you should have a drone valley, you should have a biotech valley,
Correct.
you should have a nuclear energy valley or something like that. So I think one question that I would have is, what are some challenges in implementing such a vision and strategy in India? Because ultimately, even these fundamental technologies would have research, and these research would lead to applications, and these applications can then be brought about by private sector companies or public sector companies. So, what are some challenges in to implement this?
I think the enabling ecosystem would be required. For example, I think the pandemic obviously has thrown up the importance that the importance of healthcare and biotechnology, and it's kind of a become like an existential question for mankind. And to ask this question, I mean, just to take on your question, I would say that so on one hand, let's say we have software and IT, and that's where you find the government, the Indian ecosystem at a certain level. And then let's say take the case of pharma and health, and while India is again the manufacturing backend for the entire world, but do are we there in terms of R&D? Are we there? So we are not there. So I would say that you would to answer your question, you would need those enabling conditions in that specific domain to kind of kick in. Maybe it's been a little easier for just the core IT and the software stack to happen, simply because a lot of this thing got kickstarted maybe 20, 30 years ago, when many of the we had a reverse brain drain, people from the US who were highly skilled. These are Indians who had gone up to study and to work in the US, and many of them have kind of decided to come back, and their role is of paramount importance in kind of either kickstarting or helping scale that effort. So big part of what you see in software and in technology is actually the contribution of these kind of people. So you can ask the same question, is that, do you have those kind of enabling factors in that specific domain? So let's say it is drone technology, or it is healthcare, or it is some other aspect. So that might be a challenge, and it'll take a lot of effort, and a lot of things will need to fall in place for that to happen.
So, Amit, another important thing that I saw as a thread in anything that you do uh, was an interesting fact that you say technology alone is not enough to build a great product company. I thought it was a very interesting point that you made, because all of us think, oh, technology is the first thing that we should get right, but you actually have had a contra view on that, saying, hey, technology alone is not enough. So can you elaborate a bit on that, and can you tell us what the thinking behind that is?
Yeah, and I can actually, this is again something which is dear to my heart, and it kind of goes back to our own experience. And we got a little lucky as well, and I'll explain what I mean by this. And so let me spend a couple of minutes on the Slideshare story, how it came about, and then I will use that example to kind of answer the question you have. So Slideshare was, there were three founders. I was one of them, and I was based in India, and two of the other people, which is my sister Rashmi, and she lived in the Silicon Valley, and she happens to be married to an American who's a software engineer. So it was the three of us who started the company. And the interesting thing about the three of us was that I was probably the most, in the sense that I was coming from a previous background into FMCG, sales, marketing. I was an engineer, but I had never coded. I had zero inclination towards tech. If I'm talking of around 99, 2000, around that time. So I was clearly the most technically challenged of all three. However, if you ask me, you know, so we started Slideshare in 2005. So if you ask me 1.5 decade hence, that what were one or two of the enabling factors that made Slideshare happen? So I would by far pick out the fact that, so we had three founders. All three came from diverse backgrounds. My sister was actually, she's done a PhD in psychology, and then she kind of went into to specialize in this area called HCI, which is human computer interaction. It's a specialized, so think of HCI as a specialized field of design. It's a very specialized field in design, but yeah, if you go to these big fang companies, you have like hundreds of HCI professionals, and some of them come from a product background, some from a design background, some from a technology background. So she was a specialist in HCI. Jonathan was a software engineer, so he was the CTO, and I came from, and I'm MBA, and I learned product management. I taught myself product management. So I think the fact that we had multiple skill sets, we had different people, left and right brain thinking combined. I think that was one of the things that really clicked in for us, and it actually we were able to and while I don't always say that Slideshow was an Indian company, but I've been asked this question. So how did you? I mean, India is so deficient in design resources. How did you manage design? And this is like 1.5 decades ago. So that's the way I answer that. Is that we were lucky as well that we had fair amount of diversity in the skill sets of the founders themselves, and we were able to kind of manage to pull this off. Now, how is that important? What you see in technology is that the technical people, the people who write code, they're very good at their work, right? But and they actually sometimes I would say they are found wanting, and they are not very good at translating that technology into how humans would use them. So there is kind of a layer between the technology and the humans, right? if you go to normal human beings and you just kind of use jargons and you kind of talk in very high handed technical terms, they would not be able to understand. So there is a very critical need and a role for somebody in the team, or somebody who has to kind of do the job of translating that technology into into the human layer, and doing it in a way that they can understand. And I think there are simpler there are the cliched term to use that is that something that your grandmother could use, right? I mean, so obviously somebody did the job of translating what a software engineer built to what our grandmothers can use. So I think that is very important, and that is what you see in Silicon Valley, is that they realize and they recognize the importance of the role in this middle translation layer. And that is where, I mean, somebody like Steve Jobs was an iconic professional and a figure, because he was an absolute master at kind of that translation. Is that how does technology at the end of the day needs to be translated into a language, into some kind of a form factor, into functionality that you and I, human beings that are not versed in technology at all, should be able to relate to. So that is something you see again in Silicon Valley, is that they not only do the technical layer very good, but they have such levels of specialization. Is that so? There is technical layer, then there is a middle translation layer where it is being translated into these products and these experiences, and then you have specialized marketing and sales to be able to kind of take it to people in a way that it is not it is cost effective, and it is virality. The whole notion of virality is kind of where you are able to infuse marketing and think marketing and sales, and if that is infused into your product itself so that it self spreads. So there's a lot of specialization in each of these layers. So and that is what I meant by that point, is that if you really want to kind of create a product ecosystem, you'll need these specializations, and these specializations need to kind of work together in a cohort to kind of build the overall uh, stack.
So interesting that you say that so many layers are needed. So what does it take to build this kind of a layer? Because these skill sets don't come so easily. These are, you know, these have to be built over time. And very interesting point that that needs to be made is, therefore, how do you get this going, especially in a, say, a decade or a 2 decades kind of a window? If you have to build this, what are the skill sets that are critical, and how does one build them? Because that's going to be fundamental to how probably the story of a birth of a great software product from India is going to happen. So what is needed, and how do you build the skill set and ecosystem for this?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say the starting point, one of the things is, obviously you have to be, first of all, very good at technology layer itself. You have to be like really strong, and you are creating really powerful and ways of building technology. So that goes without saying. The second thing is that, and this is, I remember reading this many years ago, maybe a couple of decades ago, is that the the most creativity and the most innovation actually happens at the boundary layers of two different disciplines or two different streams, which kind of is again a pointer to diversity itself. If you at a broad level, what you're pointing towards is the fact that if you create conditions where you bring diversity into the mix, right? So you get, and this diversity spawns, it kind of cuts across various dimensions. It could be diversity in terms of gender, it could be diversity in terms of, not only, it could be age, it could be diversity in terms of skill sets. There's left brain people and the right brain people, and there's the pure sciences, and there's the applied sciences, and then there's the philosophical sciences. So think of kind of uh, using diversity as a prime factor that characterizes this ecosystem itself, right? Now, what this would translate into, again, in terms, in real in terms, is that you would, and starting to see that happen. For example, so look at a lot of these tech entrepreneurs and all, they are going and starting to create these universities which are specializing in these social sciences, right? You would have heard of Ashoka University and Kriya University and Plaksha University, and all of these the people who are creating, they are all techies, they're all engineers. Actually, you might actually ask them that why are these people going and creating these universities which tend to kind of become specialists in the social sciences, because I think they've realized the value of these things, that ki too much of tech won't get you very far. I mean, yeah, you need to be really solid, strong in tech, but tech has to be kind of combined. It has to be amalgamated with some of the other skills, and I think that's a very positive development. The fact that these private universities are starting to come about, and this is clearly so. This is not coming from the government, so government may not have the time or the inclination, but this is coming from private entrepreneurs. So because they've lived through that, that experience, and they've seen it happen in other countries, and now they're saying, okay, why can't we do this in India? And they see an obvious kind of a vacuum there, is that we have the tech skills, but we don't have these other skills that needs to be combined with tech to kind of create an overall product experience.
No, I mean, I just want to go back because I think something that you said really fascinated me, which is that you come from a pure tech background and then you taught yourself product management,
Yeah.
right? So, can you talk to me a little bit about what those days were like? How did you train yourself? What were you reading? And what were your habits like? Because I think that's very interesting for a lot of people to know, because the ability to self learn and to initiate that transition yourself is the first step to going ahead and building something great. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Again, this was like you're taking me back to 2004 and 5, and let me kind of let me paint that picture, and then you will understand my predicament. So I did my MBA in 1999, and back then, when I graduated out of MBA, I was all thinking, us samay, all MBAs used to think in terms of FMCG companies and banks, and this is before the IT revolution, right? So I joined Asian Paints, spent 4 years at in a sales and marketing role. From there, I went on to PepsiCo, and I was doing key accounts at Pepsi in the snacks, food, Frito-Lays. So this was 2004 when I decided to kind of move on. And then we started this company, and the way the company was structured was, again, my sister and her husband, they were based in the Bay Area, and I was here in Delhi. And obviously, India, it was much cheaper to run and start a company here. So the initial set of engineers were all here in Delhi, and it was my job to kind of now set up an office, advertise, go and hire engineers. And while the other founders were traveling back and forth, but still the mainstay in this office was me. And I needed to hire them, and I needed to get basically get them to be productive and build these products. And you can imagine that a lot of people who come from very strong technical backgrounds, I mean, they I mean, and let me put it this way, I mean, a lot of tech people hate the marketing gang. They think of them as fluff, and especially coming from a Pepsi kind of a background, you can imagine a lot of the guys who were Linux hackers and backend engineers and system administrators. They would never in their lives imagine that I'm going to work and listen to a guy who's just come from a company like Pepsi. No way. So now I recognize that challenge. I kind of, when I as soon as I kind of set up the office and I started trying to hiring, I said, oh, come on, I mean, what am I doing here? There's a real problem here, that while I am an engineer, so the good thing is that I can think I can engineer, but I don't have the I don't speak the engineering language. I've just spent my last half a decade in a very different career. So and how do I need to kind of manage these people? And I recognize that these people may not be very well disposed to somebody like me, and it's not being personal. It's just that this is the way this entire discipline is set up, is that they would respect other engineers, and they would respect other technical people, not people who come from a Pepsi kind of a background. And but I the way I tackled that predicament was, I said, okay, you know what, I think you got to be real, and you got to be honest, and you got to be humble. So the first thing is, you got to admit that mujhe nahi aata hai. If you I mean, while there are young engineers only, but if you try to kind of put up a show and kind of act in a supercilious way, and then I think you're never going to make it. So the first thing I did was, I said, ki no, let me kind of be upfront in accepting wholeheartedly in front of the team that, boss, I don't know this. I am learning as much as you are, and I'm willing to kind of learn and do things and fail and experiment. And so that was the first thing that I did. The second thing that I did was I obviously started furiously and self learning and quick learning. And in fact, the whole thing about startups is that the kind of people who thrive at startups are essentially a quick learners and self learners, right? And I would say that the thing that actually came to my rescue, the thing that actually helped me out, was the internet. Because I don't know whether you realize it or not, but to me, the one of the biggest things about the internet is that it lets you discover yourself, right? It's a tool that you have at your disposal. And I'm obviously talking of 2005, so it was everything around the internet, whether it was bandwidth, whether it was content, whether it was anything that was available, was not at the level that you have right now. But in general, for anybody who's coming from a slightly deprived background or from a different background, if you really want to use the internet to kind of discover your interests, discover your skill sets, discover how to kind of how do you kind of pull yourself up the ladder one step at a time, I think the internet is an absolutely great tool. So I shamelessly learned to kind of use the internet. And I used to follow a lot of other people. My co-founders who are based in the Bay Area, they understood that I was kind of going through this phase where I had to kind of suddenly kind of reinvent myself in terms of professional skills, and they were very helpful as well. And it took me quite some years, almost I would say that I it took me at least 6-7 years to get to a stage where I could confidently and the way I kind of finally said that, yeah, I think I'm in control over this, is that you should be able to walk into a room full of engineers, stand on a whiteboard, and talk to them in technical terms. And when I say talk to them in technical terms, you don't need to write code, but you should definitely be able to understand how algorithms work. You should be able to kind of maybe draw a algorithm diagram on the board and explain that to engineers. And once you're able to do that, the engineers realize that this guy, I think he understands technology and he understands the way technology works. He may not be able to write code, but you can't kind of mess around with him. So it took me many years to get to that stage.
So it's interesting that you say that, and as you also talk about this whole fact that uh, imitation is the first step to innovation, right? I found that to be counterintuitive in my view, because you at one point in time we keep saying that build something very different, okay? But when you actually use this term saying build an imitation to build innovation, I found it very very interesting. That's the and I would want to know why did you say that. At the other end, I also think that we are also building a lot of imitation companies, right? So you have a equivalent of an Amazon, you have a equivalent of a Uber, you have an equivalent of something in India, and venture funds are going into these kinds of imitations. So therefore, where is the balance and how do you really get this right? Because finally you got to build something original, but how do you really do that, is the real question that I had.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's a fair bit of backlash that the Indian, I mean, in general, we would say that if you're copying something from the West, then that's imitation. And I think there's some truth to it. So I would not deny it, that that obviously you in an ideal world you would want to be original, you want to be creative. But I'll kind of flip the problem statement around and try to answer it in a slightly different way. So the question is, think of the user, right? I mean, the user has a certain problem, and you as a company are trying to build a solution that solves that problem, right? Now, if that problem has been solved by somebody else in a very convincing way, in a very fulfilling way, then then I don't think there is anything wrong in actually copying that idea. In fact, you are actually saving the user's time by unnecessarily forcing yourself to come up with a new creative solution that may or may not work. You are actually putting the user to some kind of level of discomfort, because now they have to discover a new way, and then they got to figure out whether it works or it doesn't work. So if something is working, it's actually a vote of confidence that this was already done and tried, and you should just double click on that. And I feel that that is not that we should not get into the this debate from that point of view. I think it is fine if something works, just copy it. In fact, I remember this was a statement that Jonathan, who was our CTO and who was actually born and brought up in the US and very much imbued in the Silicon Valley culture. So he used to say this on our shop floor, in our office. He used to say, um, so 1 point for creating, or 1 point for innovating, and 2 marks for stealing. So you used to say 1 point for creating and 2 points for stealing. 1 point for, and when I heard it the first time, I said, yeah, I mean, so everybody used to laugh whenever he used to say that. And we've heard that point of view that great artists steal, right? Good artists create and great artists steal. So it's kind of an embodiment of that same idea. But coming back to the point is that I feel that the problem is that if you are stuck with the imitation and you don't build on top of it, that is really something which kind of lets you down, and that is not a situation that you want to be in. It is perfectly fine to take ideas that are already working and build on top of it, right? And as long as you are doing that, I think copying others is not a problem. And you will see this, that a lot of, and even in that example, even in that article, I do cite the examples of at a geopolitical level. Look at what Korea has done. Look at what Japan has done. I mean, Japan today is the hallmark of quality, but Japan post World War II was very much a copycat nation. It was believed that they are ripping all Western concepts and designs off. And but look at how they have kind of used that as a stepping board, and then kind of graduated up that ladder. And now they are actually they are known as the hallmark for quality and fidelity. So I think that is what needs to be done. If you are kind of just copying and kind of stagnating there, not building on top of it, then I think there is a problem. Otherwise, think of the user. If you're if you're copying an idea, again, go back to that thing: 1 point for creating and 2 points for stealing. Nothing wrong in it.
No, I think we're going to make that a post, and that's what we're going to release it with, because I think that's a very very true fact. I, I mean, like you said, I think the origins of great ideas come at the edges. You were saying, right? So there was a very I was many years back. I was listening to an interview of this writer Hunter S. Thompson, and he said that when he got into the craft of writing, one of the first exercises he did was rewrite the stories of Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, because he wanted to know what is the structure of a great sentence. So he didn't go about immediately and start writing his books. He went and he imitated the masters first.
Correct.
And even in painting, you first learn how to paint. Like, I mean, Picasso had that saying, it took me 5 years to learn to paint like Raphael, but it took me 20 years to learn to paint like a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I can tell you, psychologically, I've noticed this, that if you kind of if you're forcing yourself, I need to be creative, I need to do something differently, I need to kind of differentiate myself from others, then it might be a false metric to actually track. I mean, you first got to solve that user's problem. Look at it this way: is that the user has a certain problem, or there's something about this, why this is working. So unless and until you kind of hit the right notes on those counts, what is the point in kind of just coming up with something new for the sake of it?
exactly. And I mean, just going back to that entire thing about the craft of product management, it almost sounds like it's a stack of skills,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
and each stack is superimposed on a different skill. So to a certain extent, they're all it's almost this wonderful concoction of different colors and skills and smells. It's almost like a little festival if you really think about it, where you got to know how design is, how the technology is working, what the user's doing, how you're growing. So when you have so many different threads, what are some systems and frameworks as a product manager that you were using to track these different problems, anticipate problems, and then ensure that the customer's job is being fulfilled?
Yeah, that's right. And you're talking of product management, and product managers incidentally are demigods in Silicon Valley. If you look at the hierarchy, then they are the people who, I mean, the cliched way to think of them is that they are the CEOs of products. A lot of people don't like that definition, but I think they definitely are very influential, because so think of some of these big tech companies, and they'll have like lots and lots of product managers. And these product managers, they kind of need to kind of be the internal champions for what the company is building, and but also be the external face to be able to kind of communicate to your sales teams and marketing teams and your PR. So they have a very important role. And in fact, I remember, I mean, let me recall if I can remember that saying. So this was something that my boss at LinkedIn used to say, that the ideal product manager is somebody who has the brain of an engineer, the heart of a designer, and I think the speech of a diplomat. If I'm remembering this, I can send you that quote later, the exact words. So the brain of an engineer, the heart of a designer, and the speech of a diplomat. It kind of mirrors this diverse skill sets that a product manager needs to have to be kind of to be in charge of what they are building. So you are right in saying that I think product management, you need to kind of typically have very highly skilled, very highly qualified people who've learned experientially, and they need to be kind of supplemented with now obviously, because data is becoming such a big thing, and data skills are something that not everybody, a lot of these product managers, unless and until they came from a very strong data background, that's not a skill set that they would have. But typically, what happens in some of these companies is that you look for multi-dimensional people themselves. They should have kind of gone through ideally multiple experiences, multiple professional experiences in their life. And once they are in those positions, and you kind of supplement them with either design teams, data teams. So it's kind of almost like a 4 5 6 member hierarchy, or a think tank for at which is kind of um, at the helm of each product. And essentially they are trying to kind of act as mini CEOs for what that product needs.
So, which brings me to the next biggest transformation, Amit, that you made, which is moving from a private sector job to a public sector job. And you are the architect of the digital locker project, the open forge project. And these are projects of immense scale, diversity, different departments coming together. What were, and maybe these are projects which clearly you have to deal with ambiguity. You really did not know where to start and where to kick it off. How was the early days? How did you maneuver through this, what I call as the twists and turns of such immense scale that you were coming into, the culture differences? Talk to us about it.
Yeah. So definitely, I think the transition from the startup world to the government world was in my case honestly not a planned one. So it was very serendipitous, and it kind of came as a little bit of a bolt from the blue. And let me just dial back. So basically, the context was that I was exiting from LinkedIn and Slideshare in 2015, and my plans were to kind of take a couple of years off, do a sabbatical, and then come back into the startup ecosystem. And but I had always been, given my background with products and all, I had always been a volunteer with iSpirit, with NASCOM, with these industry bodies, which the government connect actually happened through one of these, the work that I was doing with iSpirit in particular. And through them I happened to go to the government Ministry of Electronics and IT. There, the bureaucrats, they happened to, we talked to them, and they got to know about my background. And then they kind of offered this role to me, and my initial reaction was that, no, of course not, sir. I mean, this is not what I'm thinking at all, and I'm just helping out iSpirit in terms of some policy work. And but they kind of were persistent. They asked me to reconsider. Then people at iSpirit also did that. I talked to Nandan Nilkani. He also gave his perspective. And then finally I kind of said, okay, you know what, I think it turns out that while I was not planning for this, but this is a very unique opportunity to kind of to work in the government. I would correct you though a little bit. I didn't take up a job per se. This was more like I was taking out 3-4 years out of my professional schedule and saying that I'm going to kind of devote this completely to the government. It wasn't a job in that sense, but it was full time, an operational role that I took up in the government, but it was time boxed. So when I was getting in, it was clear that I was doing it for a certain number of years, and then I would exit out of that, or maybe take a decision at a later stage. And the government setup is such that when I kind of went there and spent a few initial days, I kind of realized that obviously I'm kind of an absolute alien here, right? And I actually used the same the example that I gave you earlier, where I made that transition from a marketing sales career to a technology career, and the way I handled that, I kind of actually started putting on that same hat. I said, I while I know a lot about my domain, and that is something I've been fortunate enough to learn during the startup stint, but as I'm entering the government, I got to kind of leave behind a few things at the doorsteps. If I kind of if I carry those along into the government system, I mean, the government obviously is kind of getting me on board because I have certain skills, that goes without saying. But the way you handle relationships, the way you kind of work with a very diverse set of team, it's a completely different environment. I got to kind of in many ways zeroize myself, got to kind of reduce myself to the level of a zero at a least common denominator, and say, hey, you know what, I'm willing to start from zero base here. As far as the government is concerned, I do come with certain skill sets that is something I'm bringing to the table. But apart from that, I am willing to kind of just zeroize myself and start from zero base and just work my way up the ladder. And I think that had a really it was something just intuitive that came to me, is that and I've always been like that you got to be real, you got to try to be humble, you got to not throw your weight around and think too much of yourself. That's the way to kind of I try to run, in general. That's the way I am. I think that turned out to be a really good thing in hindsight, because while it is true that so a lot of people inside the government, when they looked at me, I mean, I was threatening to many people as well, by the way, right? In terms of, so here's an outsider who's been brought in by the top brass, and you can imagine that the kind of politics this would kickstart inside the organization, the kind of a threat that they would see of me. But to me, because I had kind of started from zero base, I had kind of put myself in that frame of mind. I think I was able to get a lot of people to believe in me. They said, okay, no, you know what, this guy has to be having the right intentions, right? And they kind of, in turn, I would say, they kind of extended their support. So I was able to get a support from a lot of the government people who actually came forward, because I think they kind of felt that, no, I think this person is genuine, and he's trying to kind of make a difference, and he's leaving behind his earlier world, and coming to a very different world. So that, I think, was very, I would say, impactful. It kind of helped me kind of win over the confidence of the people who are working in the ministry, because also it is to do with the fact that we were kind of handling a data project, right, while I was inside the government. But many of these departments, they look at these databases as their fiefdom. This is their real power over, call it, citizens, or even the bureaucracy. Or so, for Ministry of IT to go and say that, we are building a project, or we are building this product, and it is all about sharing of data, and you got to kind of participate in these projects, it is kind of threatening to many of these departments in that sense as well, because they kind of, this is a database that they have nourished, and they have kind of kept within their own departments. And now I come in and kind of I'm trying to convince them that you got to participate. So overall, I would say I was lucky as well. My counterpart in the government, so what the government did was, they kind of paired me up with a technology director. He was a senior person from the National Informatics Center, NIC. and he was a big believer in open source technology. So he used to be posted at Ranchi in Jharkhand. But when I joined the government, so he was put on deputation. He was brought to the center, and he and I were kind of made put together in the same team, and the project was kind of assigned to them. And I was lucky to have him, because I think he had the while he was coming from a typical government background, but his thinking and his intentions and his motivations were absolutely right. I think so. I consider myself very lucky that if I had not had him to kind of backstop me, it would have been very difficult for me.
Great. Amit, all the India stack and the Open Forge, they're all under the umbrella of the Digital India program, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, so I think a question that I have is, yeah, I wanted to know what is the difference between a digitized nation and a digital nation? Because when you think about a digitized nation, you're talking about the DigiLocker project, you're talking about UPI and stuff like that. And then when you're talking about a digital nation, you're talking about technologies like DAOs and cryptocurrencies, etc. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between being a digitized nation versus a digital nation?
Yeah, I mean, I would honestly keep the DAOs and the cryptocurrencies are at a different level of maturity. So maybe, I think they are not at a level where you can really extrapolate the government systems and see how they are going to kind of interact with that. So I would keep that out of that debate. But to answer your question, I kind of maybe, you can think of them as a continuum. And if you go back to to the history of computerization in a country like India, so to the best of my understanding, computers started coming around about in industry and in maybe in government sometime in the mid 80s or so, right? That is when I think the governments of that time, they kind of that is the first flush of advent of, I mean, I think Infosys got created in 81 or 82, and um, right. And initially, if you look at the a lot of what was happening was what I would describe more as digitization. Is that there are offline processes, there are offline records, there are offline databases, and all those things were happening in the offline world. What started happening was that there was a digital equivalent of it that was created. And to give you a practical example, imagine, like 30 years ago, when we used to travel in via these trains, right? We used to go to these train stations and stand in a line. We used to be giving these small tickets, and those were all manual processes. And sometime maybe around the mid 80s or early 90s is when the computerization happened, and all of a sudden you started getting these computerized tickets. So I would say that that is the era of digitization, where the focus was on kind of essentially bringing offline manual process onto the digital space via essentially computerization. And even the internet kind of came in a little later, right? But uh, now to your question about, you're talking about digital India and the digital economy, I think you're talking of the next evolutionary step in that continuum. That if you kind of believe so now you know so internet is believed to be the fourth industrial revolution, right? So it's a change of that magnitude, it's a change of that level of quantum. And and now you are kind of in a situation that pick up anything. It's not just a few sporadic things here and there. Pretty much everything that we are, so look at the way we are conducting our professional lives. Look at the way we are having office meetings. Look at the way we are kind of talking to our colleagues. Look at the way in our personal lives we are kind of buying stuff from e-commerce. Look at the way we are entertaining ourselves. Look at the way our children are getting educated. So what you see is that pretty much any any use case that you can think of, there is now a new way of completely reimagining that compared to what we had 30 years ago. So it goes way beyond just the use of computers. It's a fundamental reimagination of how those processes or those things are going to be kind of run. So to my mind, I think that is what you mean by a digital economy. That is what you mean by digital India. Is that and there's and these were let me kind of spend a minute on that. This was again a key insight that I kind of picked up in the government. And it was very counterintuitive. I never thought of this. So how do you describe government systems? So in the government, a lot of the work, the way it happens is that these are preordained rules, these are preset, predefined rules. And what is going to happen is kind of essentially kind of somebody is going to follow these rules, and then that's how work will happen. And if you see, essentially one of the attempts in that kind of a system is that you are trying to take away individual discretion. You're saying individual discretion can actually lead to maybe corruption or some kind of a hazard. So you try to remove the individual discretion, and in turn have a set of preordained and predefined rules, and let that run the system. That's how most government processes and systems tend to work. And we know that actually this is well understood. Now, the funny thing is that if you look at computer software and you go back to the definition of what is an algorithm, you realize that an algorithm also has pretty much a similar definition. That algorithms are nothing but a set of predefined, preordained rules. I mean, it's maths, it's mathematics at work, right? But if the rules are defined, then you kind of essentially are taking away individual discretion, and you can automate and you can digitize all that. So essentially, if you put these two phenomenon together, what you're saying is that if you can actually successfully embed software systems inside government processes, right, you will be able to kind of achieve or replicate a lot of what the government was anyway trying to do. Because the core idea behind how the earlier system works and how the new system works is that they are trying to kind of automate and digitize and take away individual discretion and replace that individual discretion with a set of preordained rules. So this was counterintuitive to me. I didn't realize this. And talking about digital India, I think it's kind of taking that same paradigm. Is that, imagine a system wherein you have the different areas, different segments of our economy digitized. You have these processes which are kind of being run via digital systems. So that's probably what we understand of digital India.
So, Amit, as you see, the DigiLocker project is one of the components in the Digital India project, right? So,
Correct.
and when you really architect and think about a platform like this, you obviously have no past data on what's going to be the adoption, how many transactions are going to happen in a minute, okay, who's going to be building and using it. So how do you really build the fundamental infrastructure for something like this when you don't have past data, and how do you go about scaling it when adoption also starts moving up? How do you really think through this a project where you don't have any past data at all?
Yeah, yeah. I'll try to answer that, but before that, let me kind of double click on one of the other phenomena that you see, and there's a fair bit of criticism about this as well. Is that, so a lot of people who kind of spoke against, or they had reservations about Aadhaar, they were kind of bringing to the fore the fact that the technology creation was preceding the legal part. I mean, you didn't have the laws, you didn't have the rules, and you went ahead and built the technology, right? Now, and so that was one of the primary criticisms, is that you first have built something, and now you are kind of backfitting the legal process and the legislative process with it. And so this doesn't work. I mean, maybe I think there is there is some truth to that argument, but this is the way the technology world has evolved all around. I mean, if you go back to the end of the 20th century when internet came about, I mean, this is what happened in Silicon Valley in the US as well. Is that the governments took a very expansive and a very accommodative view. They said, we really don't understand this medium so much. So if we kind of come in and put in a lot of restrictions, the section 230 and DMCA that people keep talking about, it was a very liberal and a very expansive kind of a way of looking at it. And that was the thinking, is that early on you really don't have a lot of background information, you don't have a lot of data. So how can you kind of come in and kind of try to kind of front load that? So now to your specific question, is that, I mean, I guess that is one of the big challenges with many of these platforms, and definitely with DigiLocker. In fact, DigiLocker I think was even worse example of this, um, because this platform or I think the context was this, that around 2015 or 2014 the government started thinking, so they said that we have about 60 70 Aadhaar numbers which had been given out by them. So the government was reasonably confident that the Aadhaar platform is up and running and it has had early successes. So now the fact that you have Aadhaar, and the Aadhaar was always built as an API. So, what are the other products and services that you can build on top of Aadhaar which leverage and utilize these APIs, the API capabilities of Aadhaar? And that is where the thinking was that, can we have a payment system which kind of, uses, borrows from Aadhaar? Can we have a document management and a data system which kind of, leverages Aadhaar, which is where DigiLocker kind of came in. But there was no other system like this. So when the government looked around for comparable examples and benchmarks across the world, it turned out that nobody else had kind of built something like that. Uh, so which was kind of disappointing and as well as challenging. At the same time, the government said that, okay, let's kind of take it one step at a time and think of it like a pilot or an experiment, and see, let's put together a team. And that's when I kind of came in, and they kind of gave us the mandate. They said that you have to go and build something. They didn't, I mean, this wasn't officially told to me, but I think it was very obvious that okay, this was they weren't sure whether the platform could be built or could it exist or not. So they were giving us the resources and the time, and they were saying that you go and try to build this, and let's maybe talk in a couple of years and see how far this has reached. So it was very much kind of an experimental thing, unlike some of the other platforms, unlike let's say an UPI, or unlike let's say Aadhaar, where I think they started with a different and I think the reason for that is because the in let's say take the case of UPI, the payment rails always existed, right? Physical payment systems already existed. Your RTGS and all these systems already existed. UPI was a new way of kind of utilizing the digital rails to kind of have the payment system. Even for Aadhaar, I think they kind of had the Aadhaar, some of the Aadhaar rules laid down, and then they said, okay, let us kind of now issue these IDs to all the citizens of the country. So I think there was more depth and more method in those examples than initially there was in DigiLocker. DigiLocker was definitely more experimental. Let's see how this goes. And that was challenging, but I think we had good, very good support from the ministry, and we were lucky as well. I think in a few cases, as I said, that my counterpart in the government, I think he was the right partner, and we went about it step by step, one by one. I think broadly in terms of the platform itself, I think we made one of the key decisions was, so if you look at the platform, the way it works is that you first got to undertake digitization of these databases, right? So it's like what we call the issuing part, is that you got to first get government departments and ministries to issue their records into the platform. Once you have the baseline digitization, that's when this data starts getting consumed for processes and things like that. But the consumption will kind of come in a little later. You got to first start with digitization. So initially one of the decisions was that let's focus on digitization. Let's kind of just try to solve the starting problem. And the starting problem here is the fact that government systems are traditionally built in siloed methods. They don't talk to each other. Many of them have very legacy architectures. Now if you go and tell them that we are building this application in the Ministry of IT, and your databases need to talk to our platform, then it is possible that you will have to actually go back and re-architect some of the government systems, right? Some systems might be readily kind of you'll be able to kind of use the APIs, but in many of the cases you'll have to go and fundamentally re-architect the system. So we went about in a slow way, step by step, one by one. We started going to the ministries, convincing them. As you might imagine, there was fair bit of concern, they had questions. Some people said, okay, nobody wanted to be the early adopter, right? And I would say that, I think that what I've seen in the government are there's some ministries which have been very, they've really helped, or their the basic, let me put it this way, is that they've been far more forthcoming and far more experimental themselves in the initial phases, because at that stage the platform wasn't really kind of very mature. But I've seen many government departments actually being very supportive. And so then we started, so it's taken us almost 4 or 5 years now. But I think the first part of the problem of the digitization piece itself, so that is something that the team has done a very good job. I think we still need to work more on how this data needs to be consumed, how you kind of actually ensure that the platform, now that it has the right level of digitized documents and data in it, how do you actually utilize this data? And that's actually quite challenging, in the sense that now you will have to go and embed all these in digital, via digital processes in each use case. So it's kind of slightly more long drawn effort. But yes, I think we have the way I kind of always tell the team is that I think we have version 1 of the platform. We've done a good job. Now let's kind of work towards the second version and take it up from there.
Wow. Just to sort of follow up on that, you initially touched upon you build the technology, but there was no legal uh, sort of basis for it, and that led to a conversation about the politicization of technology to some extent and stuff like that. And when so a question that I have is, nowadays when you're working, so for example you have iSpirit and the entire India stack conversations going on about different technologies and stuff like that in terms of legislation and policy thinking. So my question is, if you want to bring forth a technology that's futuristic to some extent, or a technology that will say like nuclear, that will be a great answer to climate concerns or something like that, how must a technologist work with a policy expert or a legal scholar, and what should be the outcome of that conversation in your opinion?
Yeah. So I would say, to answer your question, one of the great things that has happened is that the internet is just kind of bridged these gaps, right? I mean, you find that people from the private sector, people like me, have come and worked in the government. You also see just this thing happening every day on social media, is that there is so much more connect now between the governments and private enterprise and the startup world and with academia. Is that, and why is this happening? It's happening because that's what the internet enables. It kind of shortens these distances, it turns the world into a global village, to use a cliched terms, right? I mean, the other day I was there was this incident that happened where you might have followed this. I think the government announced something, the railways ministry announced something about IRCTC, about how they are going to kind of take keep a part of the commission structure. And there was, the stock markets reacted very negatively. IRCTC stock just kind of crashed. And within the next I think 12 hours or 18 hours, the government actually came back and said they reversed their earlier decision. Now, why did that happen? I think, if you ask me, it happened because of the internet. Is because the internet is this great thing where it kind of magnifies all these reactions. That if you've done something right, it magnifies that. There'll be millions of people clapping. If you've done something which is not right, it'll again magnify that, and immediately you'll know. And now, if you go back 30 years, imagine a situation. Do you think that maybe the government after 15 days, after 30 days, would have even realized कि ये problem है? यहाँ पे क्या है, real time में, if you do something and people don't like, the powers that be in the government, within hours or within minutes, if they are active on social media, they'll know that what the reaction is. So to answer your question, I think this is the great thing about the internet. This is the great thing about the medium, is that the medium itself is bringing things together. Secondly, I think there is obviously the realization in the government is that, see, the internet is not just not just to go back to my earlier point, is that it's not just about digitization. This is a fundamental reimagination of how people in this world are going to go about conducting their personal lives, their educational lives, their professional lives, their how they are going to take entertainment. So pick up anything, and now there is going to be a new way to do that. So they themselves are very forthcoming. They themselves are going to reach out and say that, okay, what are the newer trends, who are the people who are maybe the domain experts in this area. And the fact that I actually ended up working in the government is a prime example for that. You might actually say, okay, how did this even happen? Is because the government had realized and that they needed expertise, and they were honest enough and humble enough to say that that expertise did not exist within the government. So I think that's happening. It's aided by the internet, and the fact that internet, for good or for bad, it tends to, it's kind of made it real time, on demand, magnifies all these reactions. So I think you will see different stakeholders being brought together by the internet towards some of these goals.
So, Amit, a project like this, which is almost, I would call it transformational to a citizen's life, to a nation's way of doing business, never attracts venture capital, right? It attracts government capital, you know. So the real challenge of getting the innovation that you talked about early in our conversation, which is building the great product, building the an innovation that has never been done before in this part of the world, attracts needs to attract a certain kind of a venture capital, and I would call it patient capital, right? So what are the challenges of getting that kind of a patient capital in, say, projects like these or ideas like this, and where do you see the gaps and how do we really bridge it?
And your reference is largely to government projects.
I'm saying it largely to multiple projects, right? So a project like this, I won't think venture capital would be interested, but I would say that uh, something transformational like this, right? The real challenge is the gestation period is always longer than, say, the venture fund's life, right? Which is
Okay.
like a 5 year or a 7 year and things like that, right?
I would honestly take a slightly differing view. I would say what I mean, I told you about how DigiLocker happened, and I would say that what the government did was not textbook venture capital the way we understand it. But I think there is a certain public or a governmental equivalent of that was done actually, because they kind of said that this is a pilot. They obviously put aside a budget for it, and the budget was part of the Digital India budget, so there was clearly for it. But it was like seeding, and there is an idea, and you got to kind of give seed money to that idea, and this idea has to be implemented from within the government. So I would disagree. I do think there is, I mean, it's not traditional venture capital, but it is some government equivalent. I don't have the right term, but I do think there was some element of that. But I to take on the point slightly broadly, one of my learnings has been that, and let me kind of, okay, let me take a step back, is that actually I've also received a lot of criticism for why does the government keep on building these platforms. I mean, and we know this, right, that you pick up any area, you'll find 5 government platforms that are already existing, and none of those 5 would be working actually. Right, so there is this thing about constantly keep on building. And I remember back in 2015 when I told my friends, and it was well known that I'm going to be heading this team which is going to build a platform. One of the criticism I had to face was that government keeps on building platforms, so you've just kind of why are you kind of trying to build a platform? And I would say it's a fair question to ask. It's an absolutely fair question to ask, that because if we are saying that it is not the government's job to run Air India, then why do you think that it is the government's job to run Aadhaar or DigiLocker? I mean, maybe that question needs to be asked. And I initially didn't have the answer for it, but I think now 5 years hence I can articulate that much better. So there's clearly things that the government should not do, right? The government should not be in business, and let me qualify, this is my personal point of view, so please take it in that sense. So very clearly, there are things that the government should not do, right? The governments by and large should not be operating businesses and running them, right, unless and until there is a strategic interest involved there. However, what you also see is that there are certain areas where somebody in the system, and somebody who has the resources and somebody who has the stakes in the system, needs to kind of disproportionately allocate resources and spend time and make effort and do the foundational work, right? Because if you don't do the foundational work, the chances are it will never get kickstarted. So you're kind of in a situation where a lot of times you're confronted with a situation is that unless and until you actually sink in the money and do the foundational work, this thing would never exist. And I think the project that I work for the government, DigiLocker, it's a fantastic, it's a prime example of that. Is that unless and until somebody had said that, this is like a money that we are putting in, we don't know whether this is going to work or not. An idea like this would never have kind of taken off ground. But once that foundational, it is also true that once that foundational work is done, then the operating parts of that platform or that system need to be kind of uh, palmed off, or kind of, I think it needs to be some kind of a public partnership, private partnership, wherein again the government should not, it should kind of stick to the basic premise that it's not the government's role to kind of be running businesses and running lots and lots of these platforms. The government should only be doing very basic, very minimal, very foundational work. Right? I would say that running a Aadhaar and a DigiLocker kind of a platform is kind of falls under that ambit. But but by and large, you have to kind of figure out a public-private partnership model in which you invite the private sector, you invite different parts of the ecosystem to kind of build on top of what the foundational APIs are or what the foundational systems are, and then take it to the market. That is a role that the government cannot play and should not try to play.
So, Amit, speaking of venture capital, you were featured in an Economic Times article titled Rise of a New Tribe of Angel Investors. Reading that, it made me realize that India might be, there's a very interesting trend I noticed in it, that, we might be in what I call VC 1.0, which is, you have a large swath of individuals running venture capital firms without startup founding or operating experiences. And you have an equivalent of that in the history of VC in the US, where you have your Don Valentines and you have your Art Rock and your Tom Perkins running VC firms without having really started startups. And now we have a new class of angel investors in India, such as yourself and many others on that list, who have had a history of starting and running successful businesses. So, are we on the threshold of such a transition? That's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, can you also elaborate what is the difference between the advice a VC gives with operating experience versus advice a VC gives without operating experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think this point that you are referring to, it's kind of a little bit of a debate, especially in the VC world, about operators versus non-operators, and what is the value add or what is the role each can play. I mean, I'd like to answer that question in a broad, maybe a philosophical way. Is that what my learning in life has been, that too much of anything is to be avoided. Too much of anything is bad. I mean, you got to kind of go by that general principle. Is that the reality is that there is so much diversity, there is so much if you just look at the world around you, there's just so much diversity, there's so many things, and to expect that there is only one way to do it is maybe not the right approach to have. So there are multiple ways to solve a problem, there are multiple perspectives, there are multiple things people can bring on board, and we should generally be kind of keep our eyes and ears open. So while I come from an operating experience, and I would probably be more aligned to operator VCs, but I do think that I would not rule out the value of people with non-operational experience, people coming from financial backgrounds, and they might be good at financial engineering, and there are certain markets and certain opportunities where actually the financial engineering might play a bigger role than the technology innovation there. That is just the way of it. I mean, I think there are parts of e-commerce which kind of, in my opinion, you don't necessarily need to be a very creative company at a tech level per se to kind of build a large and an impactful and influential system. So my personal view is that actually, as I said, too much of anything is bad. So I wouldn't kind of confine myself to one end of the continuum. I think there's scope for operator VC kinds. There's also scope for non-operator VCs, and I think the trick here is that in the specific situation or what you are trying to kind of build for, I think you got to kind of analyze and understand what is that ideal mix for you, what kind of a person to bring on board. It is possible that having an operator might help. It is also possible that yeah, I mean, some operational experience would help, but I don't think I mean, there are many areas, for example, where if you are completely like coming up with a new paradigm, a new model. I mean, what would prior experience kind of help you, right? And I remember this one of these quotations I read somewhere. It says that startups need the experience of people who have done it before and the enthusiasm and energy of people who haven't done it before. They need both, actually.
Thanks, Amit. I think we're coming to the end of our conversation, and there are a couple of rapid fire questions that we have for you. So, the first question from my side is, what does the word successful mean to you, Amit?
Oh, I mean, this is not rapid fire. This is philosophical. I think now I do think that one should have my views are more kind of aligned towards trying to have a balance in life, not just professional success, but things like family, things like society. I mean, I think when you are like at a certain age bracket and you look back at your life, you should be able to say that, okay, I did justice to different parts. And that is not the way I used to think 10 years ago, honestly, where I was knee deep in running the startup. But I think that's a change that I've seen in myself.
So, my question to you, Amit, is what are some of the books that have really influenced you over the course of your life?
Okay, that's. I mean, um, I think that I recently read Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*. Reading the second part of it. I think that's such an impactful and an amazing book, and I wish uh, I read this book 20 years ago. Right, when this is the first book in history that all of us should be taught. I was hoping that somehow this book should can kind of become a part of our education system at a very primeval, at a very very basic level. Is that is definitely something. I don't read a lot of books, honestly, and I actually blame the internet, because the internet has really killed my attention span, and I don't like that. I do do a lot of things, watch a lot of videos and all, but I hate to admit this, but I don't read a lot of books. One of the books I'm reading right now is so I play tennis, and I'm a big Rafa Nadal fan, and I'm reading his autobiography, My Story, and I'm just blown away by the intensity that you can see in his personality as I'm going through the book. You can just see the man behind the game that you see on television. So I think that is something that books obviously have this immersive thing. They just drag you out of the world, and they kind of immerse you. So that's great. But I wish I could spend more time reading.
So, my next question is, what's the best piece of advice anyone has ever given you?
Okay, I would say that one something that has influenced me a lot is if you look at what Steve Jobs taught the world, and not just about technology, but about a lot of things about how you should run your life. Many of the self realizations that people have had looking at his life and his the way he went about doing it. I think that has been fairly impactful. For example, his thing is that you can only connect the dots in hindsight, right? You cannot connect the dots when you're looking forward. It's only when you look back and you can kind of connect the things. The second thing that he said is that if you're trying to decide what area to work on, look at the thing that really excites you. Look at the thing, because finally you'll excel at something if it doesn't look like work to you. It should look like play to you. Now that was a very it's a very radical way of thinking about it. I wish I'd heard this saying, again 30 years ago when I was in school and college. But I generally find some of his writings and his quotations very inspiring.
Amit, if you could invite four individuals for a dream dinner, who would they be and why?
I think, I think Mahatma Gandhi would be one. I think his life has been inspirational. And I generally tend to kind of be more, you know, I think of myself more in the rational sense and driven more by science and the whole the rational movement. So it'll have to be a bunch of people from the scientific world. I mean, maybe somebody like Albert Einstein and Newton and Galileo would be would be would make the list.
What are the 3 or 4 pieces of advice that you would give to an 18-year-old today?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that try to discover what your real interests are. And again, I piece of advice is that if you have access to the internet can be an amazing medium in terms of helping you that, because if you can actually figure out what is it that you are really driven by, if you can identify that, I think that is a really powerful situation to be in, because then it kind of makes sense that once you have identified that area of interest, it makes sense to focus your professional career towards that direction. Unlike a lot of, and if you look at my own professional career, starting from my educational background, a lot of things I realized that I was just running myself on defaults. You got to first do your engineering and then got to do your MBA, and then good MBAs went in a certain direction. So I just kept on choosing the default things that came around. It was only when, at a certain stage, you kind of ask yourself, well, okay, what is it that you really want? And that was the shock that, when I made that switch to and startup and entrepreneurship. So that is one piece of advice I would give to an 18-year-old. Try to discover what you are really interested in, what you are good at. I would say it's good if you are, top of the class in academics, but it is also true that academic brilliance is useful in some ways, but it should not be the be all and end all, right? In the Indian educational context, you do see families pushing their kids you know uh, no end for academic excellence. And that is one another change that has happened to me, is that I am a less believer of academic excellence and brilliance than I was when I was growing up. I think, yeah, it does have some role, but if you look at the world around you, you don't see a very high correlation of people who are successful and how good they were academically.
Amit, what is something that you believe in that nobody else agrees with you on?
Let me think about this. Um, I mean, I this is partly belief and partly also hope, because I'm quite interested in sports. So I would really hope that India at some point in time in my life will be in the top three in the Olympics medals tally, and I think we can do it actually.
So, Amit, my final question to you is, having heard us speak and having done this, uh, you know, long session, if you were to recommend someone who you see would be good for this podcast as a new guest, who do you think we should look at?
And is this somebody from the technology world?
Nothing. It's you can say, it can be anybody. Not an issue at all. It's not just technology, but as you can see, as you rightly said, in your conversation, you need to be a bit of an engineer, you need to be a bit of a diplomat, you need to be a bit of, so you need all these thinking to be successful, right? So therefore, I think this whole ContraMinds podcast is about that. So,
Okay.
and imagine if you were to kind of look at a guest who you think would add value to the audience, who do you think we would you would advise us and say, get him as a guest or get her as a guest? I think they would add value.
So I'll confine myself to technology. I think one great person to talk to and introduce to your audience would be Sharad Sharma, who is the head of iSpirit. I think he's done a fantastic job, and he's also like kind of at a very interesting, he occupies a very interesting position where it's right at the between the government and industry and a lot of other initiatives. So he'd be a great person to have on the show.
Thanks, Amit. It was fabulous talking to you, and we had a great time listening to you, and some great insights and some brilliant quotes. Thanks a lot, and it was lovely talking to you.
Thanks for having me, and look forward to interacting with the ContraMinds community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amit.
Thanks for listening to this episode. For selected links and detailed show notes, visit www.contraminds.com/blog. Follow ContraMinds on social media and let us know who you would like to see next on the podcast. If you're listening to ContraMinds on Apple Podcasts, do share your comments and give us a rating. We are keen to know what you're thinking. ContraMinds is also on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and stay up to date on all our releases. Thanks for listening and stay safe.